The dust settled in lazy swirls around Peter Sullivan's boots as he stood on the platform of the Clifton, Arizona train station, nervously adjusting his collar for the 12th time in as many minutes. The year was 1882, and the Arizona Territory's copper mining boom had brought fortune to Peter's modest ranch on the outskirts of town, but not companionship. The approaching train whistle pierced the hot September air, signaling the arrival that would change his life forever. His mail-order bride from Poland was finally coming. Peter's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the worn photograph of Zofia Kowalski, the woman who had answered his advertisement in the International Marriage Gazette. Her serious expression and dark eyes had captivated him through the grainy black and white image, even if they had never spoken a single word to each other. Their entire courtship had been conducted through translated letters arranged by the marriage broker, and Peter had been so enchanted by her eloquent descriptions of her homeland and dreams for a new life that he'd quickly proposed marriage by mail. What the marriage broker had neglected to mention, or perhaps Peter had been too love-struck to comprehend, was that Zofia spoke no English whatsoever. The train hissed to a stop, belching steam that momentarily obscured the passengers disembarking. Peter stood taller, clutching the small bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered that morning. His heart hammered against his ribs as travelers began flooding onto the platform. How would he recognize her? What if she had changed her mind? Then suddenly, there she was, more beautiful than her photograph, looking lost and frightened amid the crowd. Zofia Kowalski wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. She clutched a single battered suitcase that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions. "Zofia," Peter called, pushing through the crowd. "Miss Kowalski." She turned toward his voice, relief washing over her features when she spotted the photograph of herself in his hand, the twin to the one she now pulled from her pocket, showing his face. "Pan Sullivan?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," Peter replied with a broad smile, presenting the flowers with an awkward bow. "Welcome to Clifton. I'm mighty pleased you've come." Zofia accepted the flowers with a gracious nod, her lips forming unfamiliar English words. "DZ, thank you." Her accent was thick, the words clearly rehearsed, and when Peter began speaking again, her expression shifted to one of complete bewilderment. "I've got the wagon just over yonder," Peter continued, gesturing toward a weathered but well-maintained wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch, not the grandest place, but it's home." Zofia only smiled politely, clutching her suitcase tighter. The realization struck Peter like a thunderbolt. The marriage broker had assured him that Zofia understood basic English, but the panic in her eyes told a different story. This woman, his bride-to-be, didn't understand a word he was saying. "You don't speak English?" Peter asked slowly, pointing to his mouth and then to her. Zofia shook her head apologetically. "Polski," she said, pointing to herself. "Moi po polsku." Peter felt his stomach sink. How were they to build a life together if they couldn't even communicate? The broker had swindled them both, taking Peter's money and sending Zofia halfway across the world to marry a stranger she couldn't even speak with. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, interrupted only by the bustle of the station around them. Peter scratched his head, unsure how to proceed, when Zofia suddenly reached into her small handbag and withdrew a thin book. She handed it to Peter with hopeful eyes. "Polski Angielski," she said, tapping the cover. Peter examined the Polish-English dictionary with relief. At least they had somewhere to start. He thumbed through it awkwardly, looking for any words that might help this moment feel less impossible. "Wagon," he finally said, pointing to his conveyance. Then he found another word and jabbed his finger toward the page. Dom, home. Zofia's face brightened slightly. Dom, she repeated, nodding. As Peter helped Zofia into the wagon, he noticed several townspeople watching with curious eyes. Clifton was a small mining community where gossip traveled faster than stage coaches. Already, he could see Mrs. Thornton, the shopkeeper's wife, whispering behind her hand to another woman. "Don't mind them," Peter said, forgetting momentarily that Zofia couldn't understand him. He smiled reassuringly instead and climbed up beside her. The ride to Peter's ranch was filled with awkward silence and halting attempts at communication through the dictionary. Peter would point to objects they passed: tree, river, mountain, and Zofia would provide the Polish equivalent. By the time they reached the ranch, they had accumulated perhaps 20 shared words between them. Peter's ranch was modest, but well-maintained, a sturdy 2-bedroom cabin with a barn, corral, and small vegetable garden. 50 acres of decent grazing land supported his small herd of cattle. It wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was respectable and growing. Dom, Peter said as they approached, remembering the Polish word. Zofia nodded, studying the homestead carefully. Her expression was unreadable, and Peter wondered if she found it lacking compared to whatever she had left behind in Poland. As they pulled up to the cabin, Peter's ranch hand, Miguel Hernandez, emerged from the barn. Miguel had worked for Peter for 3 years and had become more friend than employee. "Senor Sullivan," Miguel called, approaching the wagon with curiosity. "This is the bride you spoke of." "This is Miss Kowalski," Peter confirmed, helping Zofia down from the wagon. "Zofia, this is Miguel. He helps me with the ranch." Zofia offered a small curtsy. "Milo my Sai Poznak," she said politely. Miguel looked questioningly at Peter. "She doesn't speak English," Peter explained, running a hand through his hair. "Not a word of it, far as I can tell, only Polish." Miguel's eyebrows shot up. "Mater de Dios, how will you?" He stopped himself, seeing Peter's distress. "Perhaps my wife can help. Rosa speaks 4 languages, not Polish, but she has a way with tongues." Peter nodded gratefully. The Hernandezes lived in a smaller cabin on the property, and Rosa had always been kind. "We'll manage," Peter said, more to convince himself than Miguel. "The marriage broker sent a dictionary, at least." Miguel nodded skeptically but smiled warmly at Zofia. "Bienvenida, senora," he said, tipping his hat. Peter led Zofia into the cabin, suddenly seeing it through a stranger's eyes. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy oak table with 4 chairs, and a modest sitting area with a worn but comfortable sofa. The walls were adorned with a few photographs and a pair of antlers. It was a bachelor's home, functional but lacking feminine touches. Zofia set her suitcase down and turned in a slow circle, taking in her new home. Her face revealed nothing of her thoughts. "It ain't much," Peter said, forgetting again that she wouldn't understand, "but it's clean and sound." He watched as she approached the fireplace and touched a small carved wooden horse that had belonged to his father. "Peekney," she said softly, looking back at him. Peter frantically flipped through the dictionary. "Peekney, Peekney," he muttered, scanning the pages. "Beautiful," he finally translated, looking up with surprise. Zofia nodded, placing the carving back carefully. "Beautiful," she repeated in halting English. A small spark of hope ignited in Peter's chest. Perhaps they could make this work after all. That evening was a study in awkward pantomime. Peter showed Zofia where everything was kept in the kitchen, though he had planned to take her to the town's only restaurant for their first meal together. Now, with the language barrier so much more significant than he'd expected, He thought it better to avoid prying eyes until they had found some way to communicate. Zofia took over meal preparation with quiet efficiency, examining his meager provisions with a practical eye. She found flour, lard, salt, and some dried beef, and set to work with practiced hands. Peter watched in amazement as she created a hearty soup and some kind of dumpling he'd never seen before. They ate in near silence, occasionally attempting to exchange words through the dictionary. Peter learned that the dumplings were called pierogi, and Zofia learned that Peter's cattle were beef. Small victories that felt monumental in their isolation. After dinner, the true awkwardness descended. There was only one bedroom prepared Peter's, as he had assumed they would be married upon her arrival. Now, that assumption felt presumptuous and impossible. "You sleep here," Peter said, showing Zofia to his room. He pointed to himself and then to the sofa. "I sleep there." Zofia's brow furrowed as she tried to understand. Finally, comprehension dawned and she shook her head vehemently. "Nye," she protested, pointing to herself and then the sofa. "I sleep there." "No, miss, I couldn't," Peter began, then stopped. How could he explain gentlemanly behavior when they shared hardly any words? Zofia seemed to understand the dilemma. She sighed, then surprised Peter by taking his hand and leading him back to the main room. She pointed to a calendar on the wall where Peter had circled today's date, September 15, 1882. "Slub?" she asked, making a gesture like she was putting a ring on her finger. Peter consulted the dictionary. "Wedding," he translated. "Yes, I thought, but now." He gestured helplessly between them. Zofia nodded in understanding. She pointed to the calendar again and held up 3 fingers, then made the wedding ring gesture again. 3 days, Peter guessed. "Wedding in 3 days," Zofia nodded firmly. 3 days, learn words. She pointed to herself, then to the dictionary, then tapped her head. Peter understood her plan. She was giving them 3 days to learn to communicate better before they would marry. It was sensible, respectful of their situation, and gave them both a chance to adjust. 3 days, Peter agreed, relieved to have a plan. "And you take the bedroom." "I insist." Though Zofia protested further, Peter eventually convinced her to take his room by physically refusing to enter it himself. Finally, with a mixture of exasperation and amusement, she conceded. That night, as Peter lay on his too-short sofa, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about in his home, he wondered what madness had possessed him to send for a bride he'd never met. Yet when he recalled Zofia's determined face as she proposed their 3-day plan, he felt something stir within him: respect, admiration, and perhaps the first seedling of something deeper. The next morning, Peter woke before dawn, as was his habit. He moved quietly, not wanting to disturb Zofia, and slipped outside to begin his chores. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of autumn despite the heat that would build as the day progressed. Miguel joined him at the barn, helping to feed the livestock and check the fences in the nearest pasture. "How was your first night as an almost married man?" Miguel asked, tossing hay to the horses. "Strange," Peter admitted. "We can barely speak to each other." "She wants to wait 3 days before the wedding. Give us time to." "I don't know, find some way to talk." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "Rosa says she will come this afternoon. She brings some things to help your bride feel more at home." Peter felt a surge of gratitude for the Hernandezes. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you both." When Peter returned to the cabin mid-morning, he found Zofia had transformed his kitchen. Everything was clean and organized, the stove was lit, and something that smelled delicious was baking. Zofia herself was sweeping the floor, her hair tied back with a scarf, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "Good morning," Peter said, removing his hat. "Or I suppose it's afternoon now." Zofia looked up and smiled. "Dizine Dobry," she replied. Then, consulting a piece of paper where she had apparently been writing notes, she carefully said, "Good day, Peter." Peter's heart skipped. She had used his first name and clearly spent the morning studying the dictionary. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing to the kitchen. Zofia nodded, then pointed to the oven. "Kleb," she said. Then, checking her notes again, "Bread. I make bread." "It smells wonderful," Peter said, realizing how long it had been since he'd had fresh baked bread. His cooking skills were rudimentary at best. They spent the rest of the morning engaged in a slow, painstaking conversation aided by the dictionary, Zofia's notes, and elaborate hand gestures. Peter learned that Zofia was 22 years old, the daughter of a carpenter, and had two younger brothers still in Poland. Her parents had died within months of each other the previous year, leaving the family destitute. The opportunity to become a mail-order bride had offered her a chance at a new life and the possibility of eventually bringing her brothers to America. Peter, in turn, told her about his own background, that he was 28, had come to Arizona Territory from Missouri 10 years earlier with his father, who had died of pneumonia 3 winters past. He'd been alone ever since, building up the ranch bit by bit. When Rosa Hernandez arrived that afternoon, she brought fresh eggs, preserves, and several cloth bundles. "Curtains," she explained, handing them to Zofia with a warm smile. "For the windows. Every home needs curtains." Though they shared no common language, Rosa and Zofia developed an immediate rapport. Rosa helped Zofia hang the curtains while Peter watched in amazement as the cabin began to feel more like a home. The two women communicated through gestures, facial expressions, and the odd word from the dictionary, laughing together at their misunderstandings. Before leaving, Rosa turned to Peter. "She has good hands and a kind heart," she said simply. "You chose well, even if you did not know what you were choosing." That evening, after a dinner where they managed to exchange more words than they had all day, Peter made a decision. "I want to learn your language," he told Zofia, his finger tracing the words in the dictionary. "Polish." "I learn Polish." Zofia's eyes widened in surprise. "Why?" she asked, one of the English words she had mastered. Peter thought for a moment. How could he explain that something about her determination, her courage in coming alone to a strange land, had touched him deeply? That he wanted to meet her halfway, not expect her to bear the entire burden of adaptation, because, he said simply, "You are learning mine." Zofia studied his face, then smiled, the first full, unguarded smile he had seen from her. It transformed her features from merely pretty to radiant. "Good," she said. Then, opening the dictionary to a fresh page, she pointed to a Polish word. "Zaczynamy." "We begin," Peter read aloud, and their first formal language lesson commenced. The next morning, Peter woke to find Zofia already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She had repurposed one of his old shirts as an apron, and her hair was braided neatly down her back. Something about the domesticity of the scene made his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Dizine Dobry," he said, using one of the Polish phrases he had practiced before falling asleep. Zofia turned, surprise and pleasure lighting her face. "Dizine Dobry, Peter," she replied, then added in careful English, "You sleep good." "I slept well," Peter corrected gently. "And you?" "I sleep." "Well," she echoed, serving him eggs and more of the fresh bread from yesterday. After breakfast, Peter reluctantly explained that he needed to ride out and check on the herd. The fall roundup was approaching, and several calves had been born late in the season. Using the dictionary and gestures, he made Zofia understand that he would be gone most of the day. Zofia nodded her understanding, then surprised him by handing him a small package wrapped in cloth. "Food," she said, patting her stomach. for later. The simple act of consideration touched Peter deeply. "Thank you," he said, tucking the package into his saddlebag. As Peter rode out with Miguel, his thoughts remained with the dark-haired woman who was gradually transforming his cabin and perhaps his heart. "You seem distracted today, amigo," Miguel observed as they rode toward the north pasture. "Just thinking," Peter replied, his eyes scanning the landscape automatically for signs of his cattle. "It's strange having someone waiting at home." Miguel chuckled. "You get used to it. Soon you will not remember what it was like to return to an empty house." Later, as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree eating lunch, Peter unwrapped Zofia's package to find thick slices of bread, some cheese, and what appeared to be a small meat pie. "Your bride can cook," Miguel commented, eyeing the food with appreciation. "She's good at everything she's done so far," Peter agreed, taking a bite of the meat pie and closing his eyes at the unfamiliar but delicious flavors. When they returned to the ranch that evening, the sun was already setting. Peter was tired, dusty, and looking forward to seeing Zofia again with an intensity that surprised him. As they approached, he noticed something different about the cabin. Lights spilled from the windows in a warm, inviting glow, and Rosa's curtains softened the rectangular frames. Peter bid Miguel good night and stabled his horse, taking a moment to wash his face and hands at the outdoor pump before heading inside. The aroma that greeted him was rich and unfamiliar: garlic, onions, and spices he couldn't identify. Zofia stood at the stove, stirring something in his largest pot. She turned at the sound of the door, and Peter was struck by how at ease she seemed already, as if she had lived in this cabin for years rather than days. "Welcome," she said in English, then added a string of Polish words he didn't understand, but whose warm tone needed no translation. "It smells wonderful," Peter said, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door, a peg that had been empty more often than not before Zofia's arrival. Dinner was a hearty stew unlike any Peter had tasted before, rich with flavors that were foreign but delicious. Zofia watched anxiously as he took his first bite, relaxing only when he closed his eyes in appreciation. "This is delicious," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "What is it called?" "Big O's," Zofia replied, pronouncing it in a way Peter couldn't quite replicate when he tried. "Polish hunter's stew." After dinner, they resumed their language lesson from the previous night. Peter had been mentally rehearsing basic Polish phrases all day as he rode, and Zofia seemed delighted by his efforts, correcting his pronunciation with gentle patience. In return, he helped her with English words for household items and daily activities. As they worked, their hands occasionally brushed across the dictionary pages, sending an unexpected warmth through Peter's fingers. Once, when he successfully pronounced a particularly difficult Polish word, Zofia clapped her hands in delight and impulsively touched his arm. The contact was brief, but left Peter feeling as tongue-tied as a schoolboy. Later, as they prepared to retire for the night, Peter again insisting on taking the sofa despite Zofia's protests, an awkward silence fell between them. "Tomorrow," Zofia said hesitantly. "Slub, wedding." Peter nodded, suddenly nervous. "Yes, if you still want to." Zofia seemed to sense his uncertainty. She frowned slightly, searching for words. "You not want—" "No, I mean, yes, I want to," Peter corrected quickly. "I just want to be sure you want to. You barely know me." Zofia considered this, then walked to the small shelf where Peter kept his few books. She returned with a stack of letters tied with string, the letters she had written to him through the marriage broker. "You know me," she said, tapping the letters. "I know you." She touched the letters Peter had sent her, which she had stored in her suitcase. Different now, but same. She tapped her chest. "Same heart." Peter was moved by her simple eloquence. Even across languages, she had a way of cutting to the heart of matters. "Same heart," he agreed, taking her hand briefly. "Tomorrow, then." As Peter tried to get comfortable on the too small sofa that night, he reflected on how quickly Zofia had begun to feel like a part of his life, as essential as air. Tomorrow, they would legally become husband and wife, yet in many ways they were still strangers. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The wedding day dawned clear and warm. Peter woke early and spent an hour chopping wood to burn off his nervous energy. By the time Zofia emerged from the bedroom, he had stacked enough firewood to last through the winter. "Nervous?" Zofia asked, watching him from the doorway with a knowing smile. Peter set down his axe and wiped his brow. "A little," he admitted. "You?" "A little," she echoed, her smile suggesting she was understating the case. They had arranged to meet Judge Thomas at his office in Clifton at noon. Rosa had offered to help Zofia prepare, and arrived mid-morning carrying a covered basket. "Go make yourself presentable," Rosa instructed Peter, shooing him out of the cabin. "And do not come back until 11:30. A groom should not see his bride before the wedding." Peter washed thoroughly in the creek that ran through his property, shaved carefully, and donned his best suit, a dark blue affair he'd worn only twice before, once for his father's funeral and once for his neighbor's wedding. Miguel helped him with his tie and offered last-minute advice about married life that left Peter's ears burning. At 11:30 exactly, Peter knocked on his own front door, feeling ridiculous but respecting Rosa's traditions. "Enter," Rosa called. Peter stepped inside and stopped short. Zofia stood by the fireplace, wearing a dress he had never seen before, a deep blue that matched his suit, with delicate white lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in an intricate braid crowned with tiny white flowers, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement or nervousness or both. "Beautiful," Peter said softly, the only word that came to mind. "Peekney," Zofia replied, looking equally appreciative of his transformed appearance. Rosa beamed at them both. "The dress was mine when I married Miguel," she explained to Peter. "I saved it, hoping for a daughter, but God blessed us with only sons. It suits her better than it ever suited me." Peter helped Zofia into the wagon, careful not to crush her dress, and they set off for town with Miguel and Rosa following in the Hernandez's cart. The ride was quiet, both Peter and Zofia seemingly lost in their own thoughts about the step they were about to take. Clifton was bustling with the usual Saturday activity. Miners off shift for the weekend crowded the saloons. Families shopped at the general store, and cowboys from nearby ranches gathered at the livery to exchange news and boasts. Many heads turned as Peter drove the wagon down Main Street with Zofia beside him. Judge Thomas, a gruff but fair man who had always treated Peter with respect, welcomed them to his office with a rare smile. "Sullivan," he greeted, shaking Peter's hand, "and this must be the bride I've heard about." The judge's ceremony was brief and to the point, which suited Peter fine given the language barrier. Miguel served as Peter's witness, while Rosa stood up for Zofia. When it came time for the vows, Judge Thomas spoke slowly and clearly, allowing Peter to translate as best he could for Zofia using their practiced phrases from the night before. "I, Peter Sullivan, take thee, Zofia Kowalski, to be my lawful wedded wife." Peter repeated the traditional vows, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Zofia, too, repeated her vows in careful, accented English, her eyes never leaving Peter's face as if drawing strength from his presence. "The rings," Judge Thomas prompted. Peter produced a simple gold band he had purchased from the jeweler in Tucson during a cattle selling trip months earlier, in anticipation of this day. Zofia's eyes widened in surprise as he slid the ring onto her finger. She had not expected jewelry, he realized, and felt a surge of satisfaction at having pleased her. To his shock, Zofia then withdrew a ring of her own from a small pocket in her dress, a man's wedding band of dark silver. "Was my father's," she explained softly as she placed it on Peter's finger. "Only thing of value I bring." Peter's throat tightened with emotion at the significance of her gift. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you man and wife," Judge Thomas declared. "You may kiss your bride, Sullivan." Peter hesitated, suddenly aware that he and Zofia had never touched beyond the occasional brush of hands or brief contact of fingers. But Zofia solved his dilemma by rising on tiptoe and pressing a gentle kiss to his lips, brief, sweet, and full of promise. Miguel let out a whoop of approval, and even the judge smiled. "Congratulations, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, nodding to Zofia. "You've gotten yourself a good man." Outside the judge's office, they were surprised to find several townspeople had gathered, alerted by Clifton's ever-efficient gossip network that the Sullivan Kowalski wedding was taking place. There were a few friendly faces, shopkeepers Peter had done business with for years, neighboring ranchers, and the minister's wife who pressed a small cake into Rosa's hands for the celebration. But Peter also noticed a few less welcoming expressions, particularly from Mrs. Thornton and her circle of friends who had appointed themselves the arbiters of Clifton's social standards. Their pinched faces and whispered comments made it clear they disapproved of Peter's foreign bride. "Don't pay them any mind," Peter said quietly to Zofia, guiding her toward their wagon. Though she couldn't understand his words, Zofia seemed to comprehend the situation perfectly. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and smiled with such genuine radiance at everyone, welcoming or not, that several of the sour faces actually softened in response. Miguel and Rosa insisted on accompanying the newlyweds back to the ranch for a small celebration. As they rode, Peter found himself stealing glances at Zofia at his wife. He corrected mentally, still amazed by the transformation of his life in just 3 days. At the ranch, Rosa took over the kitchen, refusing to allow Zofia to help. "Today you are the bride, not the cook," she insisted, though she had to use gestures to make her point clear. Miguel produced a bottle of tequila he had been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted the newlyweds. Even Zofia took a small sip, though she coughed and her eyes watered at the unfamiliar burn. As the afternoon wore on, other neighbors dropped by with small gifts and well wishes. The Harper family from the next ranch brought a hand-stitched quilt. Old Tom Jenkins, who ran the smithy in town, delivered a set of wrought iron candlesticks he had crafted. With each visitor, Zofia grew more confident, greeting them with careful English phrases she had practiced. By early evening, the impromptu gathering had disbanded, with Miguel and Rosa being the last to leave. As Rosa embraced Zofia, she whispered something in the younger woman's ear that made Zofia blush deeply. Miguel clapped Peter on the shoulder with a knowing grin. "Be gentle with her, amigo," he said quietly. "First nights are always complicated." As the Hernandez's cart disappeared down the road, Peter and Zofia found themselves truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. An awkward silence fell between them as they stood in the doorway of the cabin, the reality of their situation suddenly overwhelming. "Well," Peter said finally, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "That was a fine celebration." Zofia nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, good friends." Peter noticed she was still standing stiffly, as if afraid to move further into the cabin that was now officially her home as well. Taking a deep breath, he made a decision. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. Zofia placed her smaller hand in his, allowing him to lead her outside and around to the back of the cabin, where a small grove of cottonwood trees created a natural arbor. The setting sun cast the landscape in shades of gold and pink, and the distant mountains glowed purple against the darkening sky. "Arizona," Peter said, gesturing to the vista before them. "You're home now." Zofia took in the wild beauty of the landscape, so different from the green fields and forests of Poland. "Beautiful," she said softly. Peter turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Zofia," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I know this is strange. We are strangers who are now husband and wife, but I want you to know that I will be patient. We have time to learn about each other." Zofia's forehead creased as she tried to follow his meaning. Peter sighed, wishing he had the words in her language to express what he was feeling. Then he had an idea. Leading her back inside, he retrieved the dictionary and flipped through it until he found what he was looking for. "Cierpliwy," he read carefully. "Patient. I will be patient." Understanding dawned in Zofia's eyes, followed by relief and something warmer. She stepped closer to Peter, placing one hand against his cheek. "Thank you," she said simply. That night they shared Peter's bed for the first time, lying side by side with a careful space between them. Despite Miguel's insinuations, Peter had no intention of rushing intimacy with a woman who still could barely communicate with him. Instead, they talked in their halting mix of English, Polish, and gestures until Zofia's eyes grew heavy with sleep. As her breathing deepened into slumber, Peter watched the rise and fall of her chest, marveling at the trust this woman had placed in him. She had traveled across an ocean and a continent to marry a stranger, bringing nothing but a small suitcase, her father's ring, and a fierce determination to build a new life. "Dobranoc, Zona," he whispered, using one of the Polish phrases he had practiced secretly. "Good night, wife." Zofia stirred slightly, a small smile curving her lips even in sleep. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their shared life. Each morning, they rose before dawn, Peter to tend to the ranch with Miguel, Zofia to manage the household. They took their meals together, using the time to expand their shared vocabulary. In the evenings, they would sit at the table with the dictionary between them, trading words and phrases in their respective languages. Peter proved to have an unexpected aptitude for languages. Where his schooling had been minimal, focusing on practical subjects like mathematics and basic writing, he discovered a natural ear for the complex sounds of Polish. Zofia, for her part, absorbed English with remarkable speed, particularly when the words related to household or ranch activities she could see and touch. October brought cooler temperatures to the Arizona territory, and the fall roundup kept Peter busy from sunrise to sunset. Zofia began to take more interest in the ranch operations, watching from the fence as Peter and Miguel sorted cattle for market. When Peter arrived home exhausted one evening to find dinner waiting and a hot bath prepared beside the fire, he nearly wept with gratitude. "You work hard," Zofia explained, helping him remove his boots. "I help." As Peter soaked in the bath, Zofia sat nearby, mending one of his shirts and practicing English vocabulary. The domesticity of the scene struck Peter forcefully. This was what he had longed for without fully realizing it. Not just a housekeeper or a cook, but a partner who understood the value of his work and supported it in her own way. After his bath, feeling renewed, Peter surprised Zofia by taking her hand and leading her outside. The night was clear, stars sprinkled across the dark sky in patterns that still awed Peter despite his years in the territory. "Gwiazdy," Zofia said, pointing upward. "Stars," Peter confirmed, then carefully added in Polish, "Sa pięknie." "They are beautiful." Zofia's face lit with pleasure at his use of her language. "Your Polish improves," she said in English. "Your English is better," he countered with a smile. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still joined, until Zofia shivered slightly in the cool air. Peter instinctively put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer for warmth. It was the most intimate they had been since their wedding, and Peter felt Zofia tense briefly before relaxing against him. "Cold?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "Poland is colder. But I am not used to desert nights." Peter guided her back inside, where the fire had warmed the cabin to a comfortable temperature. As he moved to step away, Zofia surprised him by keeping hold of his hand. "Peter," she said softly, her expression serious in the firelight. "We are married 6 weeks. "Yes," he agreed, unsure where she was heading. Zofia took a deep breath, clearly having rehearsed what she wanted to say. "In Poland, my mother told me marriage is partnership, two people who—" She frowned, searching for words. "Who trust, who respect, who love." Peter supplied gently. Zofia nodded. "Love comes," she said, "with time, from trust first." Peter felt his heart accelerate. "Your mother was wise." "I trust you, Peter Sullivan," Zofia said simply. "You are a good man." The directness of her statement caught Peter off guard. This woman, who had struggled with English just weeks before, had found the perfect words to express something he had been feeling but couldn't articulate. "I trust you too, Zofia Sullivan," he replied, using her married name deliberately. "And I." He hesitated, then continued, "I care for you more each day." It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was honest, and Zofia seemed to appreciate his sincerity. "I care for you also," she said, a blush coloring her cheeks. That night marked a turning point in their marriage. Though physical intimacy still developed slowly, the emotional walls between them began to crumble. They spoke more freely, laughed more often, and gradually reduced the careful space they had maintained between them in bed. November brought the first real chill to the air, and Peter worked long hours winterizing the ranch, repairing fences, ensuring the barn was weathertight, and stocking firewood. Zofia, meanwhile, transformed the cabin's interior, adding touches that made the space more comfortable for the coming winter. She had befriended several neighboring women who taught her to make quilts, and the first fruits of her labor now adorned their bed. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Peter took out a piece of paper he had been keeping in his pocket for days, waiting for the right moment. "I have something for you," he said, handing it to Zofia. She unfolded the paper to find a letter in careful, slightly childish handwriting. Her eyes widened as she began to read. It was written entirely in Polish. "Peter," she questioned, looking up in astonishment. "I had help," he admitted. "Mrs. Nowak from the general store in Tucson. She's Polish. I rode there last week to sell cattle. She helped me write it." Zofia returned to the letter, reading aloud. "Moja droga zono, Zofia. Każdego dnia dzikuj bagu, z przyjaciela do mojego domu I mojego serca." My dear wife, Zofia, every day I thank God that you came to my home and my heart. The letter continued, expressing in simple but heartfelt Polish Peter's gratitude for Zofia's presence in his life, his admiration for her courage and adaptability, and his hope for their future together. It concluded with a phrase that Peter had asked Mrs. Nowak to translate with particular care. "Uksai kachak sai każdego dnia." I am learning to love you more each day. As Zofia read the final line, tears spilled onto her cheeks. "Peter," she whispered, "this is most beautiful gift." "I wanted you to hear my heart in your language," Peter explained, moving to kneel beside her chair. "My English is sometimes clumsy, and my Polish is worse, but what I feel for you." Zofia placed her fingers against his lips, stopping his words. Then, slowly, deliberately, she replaced her fingers with her lips, kissing him with a tenderness that took his breath away. "I understand," she said when they parted. "Here." She placed her hand over his heart. No dictionary needed. That night, their marriage was finally consummated, not out of obligation but from genuine desire and growing love. Afterward, as Zofia lay in his arms, her head resting on his chest, Peter felt a contentment he had never known was possible. "Kacham sai, Zofia," he whispered, using the phrase Mrs. Noack had taught him. "I love you." Zofia lifted her head, her eyes shining in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I love you too, Peter Sullivan," she replied in English, her accent lending a musical quality to the words that made them all the more precious to his ears. The winter of 1882-1883 proved to be unusually harsh for the Arizona Territory. December brought freezing temperatures and snow to the higher elevations, while January saw relentless rains that swelled creeks and made travel difficult. But within the Sullivan cabin, warmth prevailed. Peter and Zofia settled into a deeper partnership, as the weather forced them to spend more time indoors. Their language lessons became a favorite evening activity, with Peter's Polish improving almost as rapidly as Zofia's English. They developed a charming hybrid language between them, switching effortlessly between tongues depending on which better expressed their thoughts. Christmas was a special celebration. Though neither was particularly religious, Zofia introduced Peter to Polish Christmas traditions, including a magnificent feast on Christmas Eve featuring 12 meatless dishes, symbolizing the 12 apostles. In return, Peter showed her how to cut and decorate a small pine tree as his mother had done in his childhood. The new year brought exciting news. After a bout of morning sickness that she had initially attributed to Miguel's spicy stew, Zofia confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was expecting a child. "A baby," Peter repeated when she told him, his face a mixture of joy and terror. "Are you certain?" Zofia laughed at his expression. "Yes, Majmaz, very certain. In July we become 3. Peter lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, then immediately set her down, suddenly fearful of harming her. "Should you be resting? You need the doctor. Women have babies every day," Zofia reassured him, amused by his concern. "I am strong and healthy." Nevertheless, Peter insisted on riding into Clifton the very next day to consult with Dr. Wilson, returning with pamphlets on maternal health and a list of instructions that made Zofia roll her eyes. "I am having baby, not dying of consumption," she teased as Peter insisted she sit, while he prepared dinner, a task he approached with more enthusiasm than skill. The news of the pregnancy spread quickly through the small community. Rosa Hernandez was especially delighted, appointing herself Zofia's unofficial midwife and advisor. She began knitting tiny garments while regaling Zofia with stories of her own 5 childbirths that were equal parts terrifying and comforting. Winter gave way to spring, and as the landscape erupted in unexpected desert blooms, so too did Zofia's figure begin to round with new life. Peter found himself captivated by the changes in his wife's body, watching in wonder as her belly swelled to accommodate their growing child. "It kicks," he exclaimed the first time Zofia placed his hand on her abdomen to feel the baby move. "Like a little bronco in there." "Let us hope not so wild," Zofia laughed, wincing as the baby delivered another enthusiastic thump. As Zofia's pregnancy progressed, Peter expanded the cabin, adding a proper second bedroom that would serve as the nursery. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sundays, determined to create a comfortable space for their child. Zofia sewed curtains for the small window and a coverlet for the crib that Miguel helped build, incorporating designs from both American quilt patterns and traditional Polish embroidery. In late April, Peter received a letter that brought both joy and logistical challenges. His advertisement in a Polish-American newspaper seeking information about Zofia's brothers had borne fruit. Alexander and Thomas Kowalski had been located in Chicago, working in the stockyards and saving money to travel west. When Peter shared the news, Zofia wept with happiness. "My brothers," she kept repeating. "They are safe." "Would you like them to come here?" Peter asked, already calculating what another 2 mouths would mean for their resources. Zofia wiped her eyes, considering. "They are good workers, strong, they help with ranch." "Of course," Peter agreed immediately. "We could use more hands, especially with the baby coming, and the north pasture needs fencing if we're going to expand the herd." The decision made, Peter sent money for train tickets along with detailed instructions for traveling to Clifton. If all went well, the Kowalski brothers would arrive by early June, in time to help with summer ranch work and before the baby's birth. May brought increasing heat to the territory, and Zofia's pregnancy became more uncomfortable. Peter worried about her working in the hot cabin, and insisted on making improvements to keep her comfortable, adding awnings over the windows to block the direct sun and digging a root cellar that stayed surprisingly cool, even on the hottest days. Zofia accepted his attentions with good grace, though she frequently reminded him that Polish women didn't coddle themselves during pregnancy. "In my village, women work in fields until water breaks," she informed him, even as she gratefully relaxed in the shade of the porch where Peter had positioned her rocking chair. "This isn't Poland," Peter would reply, bringing her cool drinks and insisting she rest. "This is Arizona, and here, Sullivan women take care of themselves." Zofia would smile at the easy way he had made her part of his family name, giving her an identity and place that compensated for all she had left behind. June arrived with brutal heat and the much-anticipated Kowalski brothers. Peter rode into Clifton to meet their train, bringing the wagon to transport their belongings. He had spent hours practicing Polish phrases to welcome them, determined to make a good impression on Zofia's family. The train pulled in with its usual cacophony of steam and metal, and passengers began to disembark. Peter scanned the crowd anxiously, looking for 2 young men who might resemble Zofia. "Pan Sullivan," came a hesitant voice, and Peter turned to find 2 tall, broad-shouldered young men standing behind him. The elder, who appeared to be about 20, had extended his hand in greeting. The younger, perhaps 17, hung back slightly, watching Peter with wary eyes. "Alexander, Thomas?" Peter asked, shaking the offered hand. "I am Alexander," the elder confirmed in heavily accented but understandable English. "This is my brother Thomas. Thank you for finding us." Peter was pleasantly surprised by Alexander's grasp of English. "You speak well," he commented as he helped them load their few possessions into the wagon. Alexander shrugged modestly. "In Chicago, must speak English to work. Thomas understands but is shy to speak." The younger brother nodded in confirmation but said nothing, his eyes still evaluating Peter. On the ride to the ranch, Peter learned that the brothers had been working brutal hours in the Chicago stockyards since arriving in America 8 months earlier. They had been trying to save enough to travel west, having received only 2 letters from Zofia before losing contact. "We worry," Alexander admitted. "No word for months, then your letter comes." He glanced at Peter. "She is happy, my sister." "Yes," Peter assured him with complete honesty. "Very happy, and excited to see you both. She's expecting a baby next month." This news brought broad smiles to both brothers' faces, and even the reticent Thomas spoke for the first time. "I will be Wudge, "Uncle." As they approached the ranch, Peter saw Zofia waiting on the porch despite the afternoon heat. Her condition was obvious now, her belly straining against the fabric of her dress, but she moved with surprising speed as the wagon pulled up. "Alec, Thomas," she cried, hurrying down the steps as quickly as her pregnancy allowed. The reunion that followed brought tears to Peter's eyes as he watched Zofia embrace her brothers, all three speaking rapid Polish that he could only partially understand. The brothers touched Zofia's rounded belly with wonder, asking questions and laughing at her answers. Finally, Zofia turned to include Peter, taking his hand and drawing him into their circle. "My husband," she said in Polish, then switched to English. "My family." Peter had prepared a small welcome feast with Rosa's help, and they spent the evening getting acquainted. The brothers shared stories of their journey to America and their difficult time in Chicago. Peter explained the workings of the ranch and what would be expected of them. Zofia beamed throughout, clearly overjoyed to have bridged her old life with her new one. After dinner, Peter showed the brothers to their quarters, a small but comfortable bunkhouse he had built adjacent to the main cabin. As they settled in, Alexander pulled Peter aside. "Thank you," he said simply, "for Zofia, for bringing us here." "She's my wife," Peter replied. "Your family is my family now." Alexander studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what he saw. "In Poland, we say the measure of a man is how he treats those in his care. You are a good man, Peter Sullivan." The addition of the Kowalski brothers to the ranch proved to be even more beneficial than Peter had hoped. Both were hard workers with farming experience from Poland that translated well to ranching. Thomas had a particular way with horses that even Miguel admired, while Alexander showed a keen mind for the business aspects of ranching that complemented Peter's practical knowledge. More importantly for Zofia, having her brothers nearby eased her homesickness for Poland. The sound of her native language filled the ranch now, though the brothers were learning English quickly through daily work with Peter and Miguel. As June melted into July, Zofia's time grew near. Dr. Wilson had agreed to come to the ranch when summoned, but warned that summer deliveries were common and he might be attending another birth. Rosa assured them both that she had delivered many babies and could manage if necessary. "Women have been having babies since Eve," she told a nervous Peter. "It is the most natural thing in the world." Despite these reassurances, Peter found himself increasingly anxious as Zofia's due date approached. He took to sleeping lightly, waking at her slightest movement during the night. He limited his time away from the ranch, delegating tasks to Miguel and the brothers that would normally have taken him farther afield. "You are worse than old Mother Hen," Zofia complained good-naturedly, as Peter insisted on helping her out of a chair. "I am not invalid." "Humor me," Peter replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It's my first time becoming a father." Zofia's labor began in the early hours of July 12, 1883, a brutally hot day even by Arizona standards. Peter awoke to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply through a contraction. "The baby comes," she said simply when she could speak again. What followed was the most terrifying and miraculous 18 hours of Peter's life. Dr. Wilson was indeed attending another birth in Clifton, so Rosa took charge with the confidence of experience. Alexander rode for the doctor anyway, returning with the news that he would come as soon as possible, but they should proceed without him. Peter had expected to be banished from the birthing room as was customary, but Zofia refused to let him leave. "You are my husband," she insisted between contractions. "Your place is with me." So Peter stayed, holding her hand through contractions that seemed to tear her apart, wiping her brow with cool cloths as she labored through the hottest part of the day, and murmuring encouragement in his now fluent Polish when her strength flagged. "You are strongest woman I know, Moja Milosk," he told her as the labor intensified. "My love." "Remember that," Zofia gasped, gripping his hand with surprising force, "when I curse your name for doing this to me." But she didn't curse him. Instead, as the moment of birth approached, she fixed her eyes on his face with such love and determination that Peter felt humbled to his core. "Together," she whispered as Rosa instructed her to push. "We do this together." And then, as the sun was setting over the Arizona desert, their son entered the world with a robust cry that Peter felt in his very bones. "A boy," Rosa announced, quickly cleaning the infant and placing him on Zofia's chest. "A fine, strong boy." Peter stared in wonder at the tiny red face of his son, overcome with a love so fierce it momentarily robbed him of speech. When he could finally speak, the words that came were Polish, the language he had learned for Zofia, the language in which he had first told her he loved her. "Maj syn," he whispered, touching the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "My son. Maj pikni syn." Zofia smiled up at him tiredly, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Peter had been thinking about names for months. If the baby had been a girl, they had already decided to name her after Zofia's mother. But for a boy, Peter had a particular name in mind, one that honored both their heritages. "What about Jacob?" he suggested. "It's Jacob in English, my father's name, but Jacob is Polish." Tears filled Zofia's eyes. "Jacob Sullivan," she said, testing it. "It is perfect." Dr. Wilson finally arrived an hour later to find mother and baby resting comfortably under Rosa's expert care. He checked them both, pronounced them healthy, and commended Peter on his apparent composure during the birth, unaware that Peter had stepped outside immediately after cutting the umbilical cord and been violently sick from the stress and emotion of the experience. News of Jacob Sullivan's birth spread quickly through the community. For the next week, a steady stream of visitors arrived at the ranch bearing gifts and food for the new parents. Even Mrs. Thornton made an appearance, her earlier disapproval apparently forgotten as she cooed over the baby and complimented Zofia on producing such a handsome son. "You've integrated well," she told Zofia with surprising warmth. "Not many foreign brides manage it so successfully." Zofia accepted the backhanded compliment with grace. "I have good husband," she replied simply. "Good community. Makes integration easy." As summer progressed into fall, Peter marveled at how naturally Zofia took to motherhood. She seemed to instinctively understand Jacob's needs, responding to his cries with confidence and patience. Yet she didn't allow motherhood to completely overshadow her role on the ranch. By September, she was back to managing the household and even helping with lighter ranch chores. Jacob strapped to her back in a carrier she fashioned based on one her own mother had used. The Kowalski brothers proved to be doting uncles, taking turns holding Jacob and speaking to him exclusively in Polish. "He must know his heritage," Alexander explained to Peter. "Both American and Polish." Peter agreed wholeheartedly. He continued his Polish lessons, determined that his son would grow up bilingual. In the evenings, he would rock Jacob to sleep, singing a mixture of American folk songs his mother had taught him and Polish lullabies Zofia had introduced. By Christmas of 1883, life on the Sullivan Ranch had found a new rhythm. The addition of the Kowalski brothers had allowed Peter to expand his herd significantly, purchasing adjacent land from a neighbor who was moving to California. The increased income meant improvements to the ranch house, including a proper bathroom with a pump that brought water directly inside. a luxury Zofia appreciated especially during the winter months. Christmas Eve was celebrated in Polish tradition, with the brothers joining them for the Wigilia feast. Snow had fallen in the mountains, visible from their windows as a distant white cap on the peaks, but Clifton itself remained relatively mild. After dinner, as they sat by the fire with Jacob asleep in his cradle, Zofia surprised Peter with a gift, a leather-bound journal. "For our story," she explained as he turned the blank pages. "So Jacob will know how we came together, how his father learned Polish to say I love you to his mother." Peter was deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "We'll write it together," he promised, "in both languages, so he'll know his whole heritage." Zofia leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his in the firelight. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked softly. "When you sent for a bride from Poland?" Peter considered the question, thinking back to the lonely man who had stood on the Clifton train platform just over a year ago, nervously awaiting a stranger who would become his wife. How could he have imagined the richness that would enter his life, not just Zofia's love, but a son, brothers-in-law who had become friends, and a deeper connection to the community around them? "No," he admitted. "I hoped for a companion, someone to share the work and maybe, eventually, some affection." He turned to look at her in the firelight, this woman who had crossed an ocean on the strength of his letters and her own courage. "I never imagined how completely you would change my world, Zofia Sullivan." Zofia smiled, the same radiant smile that had first captured his heart when she spoke Polish to their newborn son. "And I never imagined a cowboy from Arizona would learn my language to tell me he loves me," she replied. "But here we are." "Here we are," Peter agreed, gathering her close. "Kachem sai, Zofia, now and always." "I love you too, Peter Sullivan," Zofia whispered back in English. "Now and always." Outside, the first stars of Christmas Eve appeared over the Arizona desert, while inside the Sullivan home, a family born of courage, circumstance, and love across languages celebrated the life they had built together word by word, day by day in a new world that had become home to them all. Years passed, and the Sullivan ranch prospered. Jacob grew into a sturdy boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's determined jaw, equally comfortable speaking English or Polish depending on who he was addressing. He was joined by twin sisters, Helena and Anna, in 1885, and another brother, Thomas, in 1887. The Kowalski brothers eventually established their own ranches on adjacent properties, creating what locals came to call Little Poland in that corner of Arizona territory. They both married Alexander to a widow from Tucson with 2 children of her own, Thomas to the schoolteacher who had come to Clifton in 1886 and been captivated by his quiet strength and gentle way with horses. Peter and Zofia's marriage became something of a local legend, the cowboy who learned Polish for love, and the mail-order bride who crossed an ocean for a new life. When Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Peter and Zofia celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a community that had long since forgotten there was ever anything unusual about the Sullivan family. And if visitors to their ranch sometimes noticed the elderly couple speaking a fluid mixture of English and Polish, switching effortlessly between languages mid-sentence as they worked together in the garden or rocked on their porch in the evening, it seemed only natural, the private language of a love that had bridged worlds, one careful word at a time.